I'm Earl Young, and I head the Special Events Committee of ALRI. And this program was my idea, and I'm very happy to say that when I went looking for an expert, the man who knew all the history of Arlington, he said he'd be happy to do this, but let's make it a 2-for-1. So today we are getting 2 experts for the price of 1, and I think there are a couple of good ones. Karl VanNewkirk is past president of the Arlington Historical Society and has edited its annual magazine since 1992. He works as a volunteer for the archaeology department at Gunston Hall, and he's taught a popular ALRI course on Arlington history for the past 9 years. Dave Farner is park manager at Fort C.F. Smith Park, conducts Civil War programs for children and adults. He is a former park ranger at Manassas Battlefield and a member of Arlington County's Sesquicentennial Commission. But now let's hear our lecturers.
Well, thank you, Earl, and thank you all for inviting us here. I'm the Karl VanNewkirk half. I see that several of the people who have taken my course are also here. I presume you've come to see whether I've changed my story. I'd like to lay some groundwork. What was Arlington like in 1860? And to begin with, it wasn't Arlington. It was Alexandria County, Virginia. Most of you probably know that this area was once a part of the District of Columbia, and the boundaries were laid out as part of the District of Columbia. However, it was returned to Virginia in 1847, so we had been part of the Commonwealth for about 13 years in 1860. The county was a little bit larger than it is now because it also included the city of Alexandria. That was the county seat of the county. And the boundaries of the county were the original boundaries of the District of Columbia. So it formed the portion of the 10-mile square that was the capital. Alexandria, the county, the country part, excluding the city, had a population of approximately 1,500 people. Of those, 1,000 of them were white, and of the black population, about 60% were slaves and 40% were free. So you can see it was a lightly populated area, and it was obviously a slaveholding area, but it wasn't completely slaveholding. In the city part of the county, there were about 9,000 more inhabitants. A couple of notable landmarks. The one main way to get from the city of Washington over to the county was by the Long Bridge. The Long Bridge was across the Potomac, approximately where the 14th Street bridges are right now. It had been built in the period 1808 to 1809. It had suffered damage from multiple causes over the years, but it had always been rebuilt. It had been significantly rebuilt in 1831, or after it was damaged in 1831. It took them about 4 years to actually rebuild it. But it was in operation, and that was, as I say, the main way to get from the north side of the river to the south side. There was a railroad, the Alexandria and Washington Railroad. Although sometimes it's called the Washington and Alexandria, I've seen it referred to both ways. It had a station on Capitol Hill and a station in Alexandria in the middle of downtown, but it didn't run all the way between the two. The Virginia portion ran from the Alexandria station to the southern end of the Long Bridge, and the district portion ran from the station to the northern end of the Long Bridge, and there was a gap of about a mile there at the bridge. It's not clear to me exactly why that occurred, but I think it had to do with the chartering agencies, that the federal government chartered it in the District of Columbia, and the Virginia government chartered it on the Virginia side, and the two didn't get together on making a continuous railway. Another way that you could get across the river was by a ferry. There was a ferry from between Georgetown and what's now Rosslyn. Georgetown, of course, was a thriving city. It was separate and distinct from Washington, the capital city, but it was part of the District of Columbia. The ferry came across to the Rosslyn area. At that time, it was actually landing on Mason's Island, which is now called Roosevelt Island. And there was a causeway between the island and the mainland on this side. And then there was a road that went from the ferry landing, or from the end of the causeway, actually, down towards Alexandria. There was another bridge called the Aqueduct Bridge. This was a possible way to get across the river, but not a very good one because it was built to carry canal boats. The C&O Canal ran on the Maryland's shore from western Maryland all the way to Georgetown. And when it ended there in Georgetown, the people of Washington, D.C. and the merchants of Alexandria wanted to get in on the action of this mode of transportation, but the canal ended in Georgetown. Well, a separate connector canal was built from Georgetown down along what's now Constitution Avenue and towards the Capitol, and a second, much more elaborate connector canal was built from Georgetown to Alexandria. The initial plan had been to just, there's a river between the two cities, and just float the canal boats down the river. But it turns out that canal boats don't make very good river boats, so they ended up making a full-fledged canal. And to get the canal across the river, they had to build an aqueduct, and that was the Aqueduct Bridge. It was located just upstream from where the Key Bridge is now, and as a matter of fact, you can still see some of the stonework from that Aqueduct Bridge. The DC side still exists, and there's the remains of one of the piers over on the Virginia side. And then the canal that was part of ran through what's now Arlington all the way down to Alexandria. Except for the remnants of the Aqueduct Bridge, there are virtually nothing remaining of that canal. Down in Canal Place in Alexandria, you can see a reconstruction of the very end of the canal. And there was also a bridge at Chain Bridge. That had been the location of a bridge since 1797, actually. It had been destroyed by floods multiple times over the years. The bridge that existed in 1860 was the sixth bridge that was built across that spot. It was built on piers that had been put up in 1852. And I point out that those piers are still in service, although bridge number 6 has long since gone by the wayside. We're now working on bridge number either 8 or 9, depending on how you count the latest reconstruction. But the piers that were put up in 1852 are still in service. And so that's a testament to the quality of the construction of the piers. In addition to the Alexandria and Washington Railroad, there was a second railroad that went through the county, the Alexandria, Loudoun, and Hampshire Railroad. It was sort of under construction in 1860, although it was partially opened. It opened for passenger service as far as Leesburg on May 17th of 1860. It followed the route that we may know as the route of the Washington and Old Dominion, or the W&OD, but it was only complete as far as Leesburg in 1860. several of the roads that existed at the time. The Columbia Turnpike had long been built and was in service as a road, and a turnpike, of course, is a toll road. There was the Georgetown Wagon Road, which is the road that we now know and love as Wilson Boulevard. And it went from basically from the ferry landing out towards the Falls Church. The Falls Church did exist. There was Glebe Road, and Glebe Road was the road that connected Alexandria to the Glebe. The Glebe had originally been the home of the minister for, it's called Fairfax Parish. And Fairfax Parish had two churches, one in Alexandria, one in Falls Church. Christ Church was the one in Alexandria. The minister, this was in colonial times, the minister lived on a farm approximately, in the middle, in between the two, at the Glebe, or now we call it the Glebe House. That house that's there, by the way, is not the original Glebe House, but it is in the location of the original Glebe House. And the road took its name from the house, and the road existed and still exists. There was the Georgetown Alexandria Road. This was the road from the ferry landing down to Alexandria. It went across what's now Arlington Cemetery, and then approximately where Shirley Highway or Route 395 is now, it's split into two roads. One of them went up over the ridge and is now known as Arlington Ridge Road, and the other one followed off to the right on the lower ground and is the road now known as Army-Navy Drive. All of those roads date back to colonial times. There was the Alexandria-Washington Turnpike, went from the foot of the Long Bridge down towards Alexandria. We know essentially that route today as Jeff Davis Highway. And another one of interest and sort of in the county is the Alexandria-Leesburg Turnpike, which we now know as a combination of Leesburg Pike and Seminary Road. What did the county consist of other than these improvements that I've just spoken of? Well, it was mostly small farms. There was one large estate, about 1,100 acres. That's the area that we now call Arlington Cemetery. The man who built and owned that died his name was George Washington Parke Custis. He had died in 1857, but the home was still inhabited in 1860 by his widow and by his daughter and by his son-in-law, Robert E. Lee, who was the administrator of his father-in-law's estate and was trying to make a go of the operation. His father-in-law had written a will in which he had promised $10,000 to each of his granddaughters and land to his grandsons, and the land part could be fulfilled, but he didn't have the cash to make the bequests to the granddaughters. So Robert E. Lee was in charge of trying to make the land profitable enough that he could fulfill his father-in-law's request. And so that's what he was doing. He was having a little bit of a hard time doing it because the farm estate had obviously been operated by slaves. In addition to the bequests that I've just mentioned, Mr. Custis had promised his slaves that they would be freed, and he put it in his will 5 years after his death. Some of the slaves got the impression that they were supposed to be freed at the time of his death, and they resented being forced to stick around. And Colonel Lee also was, as I said, was in the process, had the problem of trying to make the estate profitable, and so he was working the slaves a bit harder than they were used to, and they resented that as well. And so there were, you want to call it labor relations problems or master-slave relations problems, whatever you want to call it, existing on the farm. But that's what was going on in 1860. I'd like to go through a little bit about what happened at the beginning of the war. The local sentiment here in the county part was strongly against secession. But in April of 1861, following the attack on Fort Sumter, President Lincoln called for volunteers from all of the loyal states, which included Virginia at the time, to put down the insurrection. And this caused a sudden change of heart amongst Virginians. There was a convention that was called in Virginia, and they adopted an ordinance of secession on Wednesday, April 17th, 1861. But they made it subject to a popular vote, which would be held at the normal voting day of May 23rd that same year, about a month later. Remember, I said April 17th, they adopted the ordinance of secession. On April 18th, Robert E. Lee was called over to Washington and offered the field command of the American Army. On the night of April 19th and 20th, Lee worried a lot about what he should do. Should he go with the federal government, which he owed a lot to? The federal government had given him his education, had been his employer ever since. He had, this was his profession as a military officer for the United States. His father had been a chief lieutenant of George Washington during the Revolution. He owed a lot to the United States. And on the other hand, Virginia was obviously seceding. He was a Lee from Virginia. He felt a strong pull towards his family and his state. On the morning of the 20th, he decided that he could not draw his sword in anger against his own people. He had decided to resign his commission in the U.S. Army on the 21st, which was a Sunday. Supposedly while he was attending church, he got a message from the governor asking him to come to Richmond. On the 22nd, Monday, he left for Richmond and he never returned to Arlington. On May 23rd, when the plebiscite was to be held, a large number of the county people voted against the secession. At least in one precinct, there was about a 2/3 vote against secession. But statewide, of course, it did carry, and that meant that Virginia was, in the eyes of Virginians at least, out of the Union. Federal troops immediately crossed the river. Some of them came across on the Long Bridge and seized the high ground on this side, particularly the area around Arlington House. It was necessary to do that from that high ground. Both the White House and the Capitol building would have been within range of field guns had they been brought up there. The troops also came across the Aqueduct Bridge, marching probably single file across the towpath on that bridge, and seized the high ground above the Aqueduct Bridge. And some others took steamers down to Alexandria and took command of telegraph lines and the railroad assets. And also a big object of attention was Marshall House, where a Confederate flag had been flying in defiance of everything and visible from downtown Washington. Within the first 24 hours, 11 infantry regiments and a cavalry regiment, as well as some support troops, had made it across to the Virginia side and started on the work of building fortifications. A normal regiment in those days was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 750 to 1,000 men. So that gives you some idea of how many, probably about 10,000 soldiers had invaded Arlington within the first 24 hours. Dave?
Well, when those soldiers arrived in Arlington, they began the process of setting up their defenses. They set up some very basic rudimentary defenses around the bases of the bridges at first. 5 forts were built in Alexandria and Arlington, primarily to defend those bridges, just to keep any Confederate attacks from coming across and into Washington. But as you may remember from your history, this was supposed to be a short war. The regiments, the guys in these regiments were largely 100-day enlistees or 3-month enlistees. They were only joining the Army long enough to march down to Richmond and put an end to the war. So there was no need to go out and build elaborate defenses at this early point in the war. Well, of course, that all changed in July 1861 when those Union troops did march out to fight the Confederates and had the Battle of First Bull Run, or Manassas. When the Union troops were forced to retreat from Bull Run, that's when they came back into this area. Troops came back into Alexandria, Arlington, and the district, and McClellan, George McClellan, was brought in to be commander of the Union troops, and immediately he set about doing two important things. First of all was training the Army, getting these 100-day enlistees, these militiamen basically, trained for what was then thought would be a longer war, and trained to go into the serious combat that they had faced at Bull Run. The second thing was to begin building the defenses that they would need around Washington to protect it from any possible attack by the Confederates. So the original plan was to build a circle of 48 forts all the way around the city of Washington, not only protecting the bridges, but protecting high ground, covering the roadways that Karl was mentioning, protecting all those routes that could be routes into the city for Confederate troops. Now, those first few days of the war, before Manassas, there was minor little skirmishes in Arlington, Alexandria. One of the most prominent ones was a little skirmish that happened out in Arlington Mill, out near Columbia Pike and where the W&OD trail is now. Some Confederate raiders attacked, only supposedly about 9 Confederate guerrillas, attacked Arlington Mill and were chased back out towards Bailey's Crossroads by 2 companies of Union soldiers. But other than that, for the most part, that first couple months were fairly quiet in the county. Troops were coming in, they were getting trained. The Union Army was building up strength prior to that attack onto Manassas and then onto Richmond, supposedly. After Manassas, when the troops came back into town and they began building those fortifications, McClellan was training them. But for a while there, in August and early September, the front line for the Civil War was actually right around Falls Church. Confederate soldiers were in Falls Church. And at that point, that's when Arlington sees really the majority of the combat that happens in the county. And by combat, I'm not talking a whole lot. We're talking about a few skirmishes, skirmishes that happened in the Balls Crossroads, Bailey's Crossroads areas, skirmishes, one skirmish that happened out around modern-day Wilson Boulevard and the W&OD trail in that vicinity. Usually just minor skirmishes. If you look through the military records and the newspapers, they talk about 1 or 2 soldiers being killed on each side and a handful of wounded soldiers. Now, when these troops, the first fortifications that were built, these 48 original fortifications, most of them are all gone. The fortifications that were built during the Civil War were nothing like the fortifications if you've seen Fort Washington over on the Maryland side or Fort Sumter down in South Carolina. Those forts were built after the War of 1812, at a time when masonry and brick fortifications were the preferred design. By time of the Civil War, the things used to make forts were wood and dirt. 2 good reasons. One is wood and dirt is everywhere. You don't have to bring any supplies in order to build them. You just need men with shovels and axes, and you can start building a fort. The second thing is, at the time, wood and dirt were actually a better defensive system against the artillery of the time than the brick and mortar. Civil War era rifled artillery could blast into dirt fortifications. The dirt would help absorb the artillery fire, help prevent too much destruction. And the other thing is, if with a fighting stopped, you could go out and fix it easily. Take some shovels and go fix it. So the first forts were built by these infantry regiments that came in from the north. Men from the Army Corps of Engineers designated where they would go, how they would be built, and the men started digging and cutting the trees. There are some really great stories about some of the work that was being done. I believe the story was Fort Scott. Fort Scott over in South Arlington was on top of a hill, about a 40-acre wooded hill. When the soldiers arrived there to start building the fort, one of the big things they had to do was clear the woods. The wood is going to, you need the wood, first of all, to clear the field of fire. You want to make sure that it's nothing that this enemy can hide behind. You also need the wood in order to start building the fort. When the men would build the fort, they would start at the bottom of the hill and cut the trees halfway through, and keep working their way up the hill, cutting every tree about halfway through. Not cutting them down, just cutting them halfway. When they got to the top, they would cut the trees halfway, and at the signal of a bugle or a cannon fire or something like that, they would cut the trees all the way through at the top. Those trees would then domino and knock all the other trees down as they went down the hill. If you read some of the diaries from the men who participated in this, they talk about this tremendous crash of thunder, basically, as the woods come down in one continuous fall. I've thought about why in the world did they do that? Well, simpler. You only have to cut the trees halfway through, and probably safer. This way you don't have to worry about guys, say the Vermont soldiers cutting trees quicker than the 14th Brooklyn guys or something like that. Now, as I mentioned at this point in the war, August, September 1861, the front line is roughly where Falls Church is today. There's minor skirmishes, but there's also a few military firsts that start to happen at this point. Balloons are beginning to be used in the Civil War in late June 1861 and start to be used more often following First Manassas. In one instance, Thaddeus Lowe sent a balloon up near Ball's Crossroads, Ballston, and to observe where the Confederates were at this point, and the Confederates began firing their artillery at the balloon. This was the first case of anti-aircraft artillery fire. Another famous incident that happened that was a military first was on September 24th, 1861. Thaddeus Lowe went up in a balloon near Fort Corcoran, which is above Roslyn, and from there he directed artillery fire from Camp Advance. Camp Advance is out near Chain Bridge. It's roughly where Fort Ethan Allen is today, out near the Madison Community Center. And he directed the artillery fire from that location towards Falls Church. And using a basic symbol, a simple flag signal, he was able to direct the artillerymen at Camp Advance as their artillery went into Falls Church and tell them left, right, short, or farther. So the first case of aerial reconnaissance directing artillery fire. This and the buildup of Union troops must have been enough to chase the Confederates out of Falls Church, because by September 28, 1861, the Confederates had pulled out of Falls Church and pulled their line back to what roughly became Bull Run Creek, the same line they had prior to First Manassas battle. Now, one of the biggest actual cases of combat that I've discovered, just looking through the research and reading the official records of the War Rebellion, happened September 29, 1861 in Arlington. And it was actually between two Union regiments. On that night, the 69th and 71st Pennsylvania were marching from Camp Advance, the Chain Bridge area, out to Falls Church on Little Falls Road. Sometime 2 or so in the morning, the troops bumped into each other out near Vanderburg's house, which is Knights of Columbus these days. And they had a small firefight, which the records show anywhere, depending on what you read, anywhere from 5 to 15 soldiers were killed and up to 30 soldiers were wounded. By far, from what I've seen, the biggest actual fight that happened in the county. After that, they started regulations about marching around enemy territory in the middle of the night. Interestingly enough, the other thing, if you look through some of the diaries about these troops that come in from places like New York and New England and other places, a lot of times when they write their diaries and they cross over Long Bridge or Aqueduct Bridge or whatever bridge and enter Arlington, there's all these stories about entering the Deep South. It's hard for us these days to think of Arlington at all as the Deep South, but they were entering a slaveholding territory. They were entering a different place. They were seeing slaves for the first time. They'd go to Alexandria and see the slave merchants, the places that they hadn't encountered before, and the plantations like Robert E. Lee's. Now, Karl mentioned a little bit about the bridges that came over from Washington, and there were some changes that were made to these bridges during the course of the war. One of the early ones during the winter of 1861-1862, the Aqueduct Bridge, it was felt was more important to be used for foot and horse transportation than as a canal bridge. So the bridge was drained, the water on the aqueduct was drained, and planks were laid over top of the canal so that it could then be used as a footbridge. Also, a pontoon bridge was laid connecting Georgetown to Mason's Island so that they didn't need the ferry again to continue on to Virginia. And during winter 1862, that little problem that Karl mentioned with the railroad not actually connecting to DC to Alexandria, well, they made a little bit of a fix. It wasn't a great fix. They did lay railroads across Long Bridge to connect the two. Only problem was, because of the bridge, there were weight restrictions. So they couldn't use engines to take cars across back and forth. They had to use horses, and they could only take lighter rail cars back and forth. So you could take a rail car between DC and Alexandria now, but it had to be hooked up to a horse team, dragged across, and rehooked up to an engine. It wasn't until 1864, 1865 that another railroad bridge was built, just near where the railroad bridge is today, that was used to then take the railroad cars straight from the district down to Alexandria and then on farther south. One of the other big changes that happened in the time of the Civil War was military roads that were constructed. One of the most famous is Military Road that we know of today. Military Road was built to connect Fort Ethan Allen to Fort Strong. Fort Strong is over off of Lee Highway near North Adams Street, roughly where Potomac Towers is today. That was the most famous military road. There's also a military road up in DC that was built at the time to connect the forts. Other military roads were built behind the line of fortifications to connect one fort to the next, extending from Fort Strong down into Alexandria and Fort Lyon. There were other military roads that were built to connect. One connected the Aqueduct Bridge to where Fort C.F. Smith is today. Another one connected Aqueduct Bridge to Fort Whipple, Fort Myer today. Now, as I mentioned, in late September, the Confederate troops pulled back from Falls Church. The rest of that winter of 1861-1862 was a time when McClellan used that time to build up the strength of the Union Army and train the Union Army. And dozens and dozens of Union regiments spent their time in Alexandria, Arlington, Fairfax, the district, Maryland, training, getting ready for combat. Throughout the rest of the war, lots of other troops were trained in this area. U.S. colored troops were trained on Mason's Island. It was a training ground for, I believe it was the 2nd United States colored troops, were raised in the District of Columbia, but it was felt that it was safer to train them on Mason's Island, take those troops out of the district and train them on Mason's a little bit more secluded in a sense. Now, in March 1862, during the course of the winter, Lincoln had been pushing McClellan to start using that army he had built and trained. So in March, April 1862, McClellan began the Peninsula Campaign, trying to attack Richmond going up from Newport News, Norfolk area up the peninsula. Now, McClellan wanted to take his entire army that he had built up to go attack the Confederates. Abraham Lincoln forced McClellan, though, to leave behind one corps of the Union soldiers. And Lincoln actually wanted the Union Army to leave 25,000 Union soldiers in the fortifications, as well as 9,000 artillerymen and about 3,000 cavalrymen whose sole goal was to defend the capital. Now, over the course of the war, these numbers usually were far, far less than that. Some of the troops in 1862 were infantrymen that became designated as heavy artillerymen. These were soldiers who were trained in two roles, how to fire artillery and how to fire rifles. So these guys their job was to defend the fortifications by firing their artillery, and those soldiers who were not manning artillery would use their rifles to help defend the forts. This sort of became one of the cushy sort of jobs for these soldiers for the next 2 years, till 1864. These soldiers They had barracks, they had mess halls, they had Washington, D.C. nearby, they had no combat. They had this good place to live, to not be out in the field fighting the enemy. So for 2 years, these soldiers manned all these fortifications. Frequently, it would be 1 or 2 companies of soldiers at any particular fort, but could have been as many as 10,000 or so soldiers, or excuse me, 10, 15,000 soldiers manning these fortifications around the city during those next 2 years. Now, the Peninsula Campaign, as you may know, didn't go so well for McClellan. He was forced to retreat and pull back to Washington in summer of 1862. In August 1862, a new Union general, General John Pope, began a campaign against Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. Now, in late August 1862, Stonewall Jackson's corps, Stonewall Jackson's half of the Confederate Army, had come north, left Richmond and come north and raided Manassas Junction, big Union supply depot. After he raided Manassas Junction, he basically disappeared. He didn't go very far. He just went back to where the old battlefield had been at Manassas. And when he disappeared, the people here in Washington got worried. They didn't know where he was. Lincoln, McClellan, Pope, or excuse me, not Pope, Halleck, the commander of the Union armies, they were really concerned about where he was. At this point, Union troops were coming back out of the Peninsula Campaign. It's beginning to arrive back in Alexandria and Arlington. But the real concern was, what was Jackson doing? On August 28th, the Second Battle of Manassas began. But at that point, they still had no idea what was going on here in Washington, even though that's 30 miles away. There's some really interesting telegrams that were going back and forth between Major John Gross Bernard, who was the head of the Corps of Engineers designed with building the forts, and Halleck concerning blowing up Chain Bridge. The plans were that they were afraid that at any moment Stonewall Jackson's men were going to be crossing Chain Bridge to get into Washington. Union troops who were arriving back off the boats in Alexandria were sent up to the area of Fort Ethan Allen, Fort Marcy, near Chain Bridge, fairly quickly to get in position there in case they had to defend the bridge from Jackson. And all during this time, August 28th through 30th, the Battle of Second Manassas is happening. And once again, it's a Union defeat. Now, one of the reasons for building this entire ring of fortifications around D.C. was as a deterrent to keep the Confederates from ever getting here. And after the Battle of Second Manassas, Robert E. Lee had a couple options. One is to stay where he is, one is to attack Washington, one is to head north. He headed north, which in what became the Antietam-Sharpsburg campaign. He realized that the fortifications around D.C. were too strong for his army to attack. Too many men, too many guns, too many forts. So during the course of the war, these 48 and eventually 68 forts that were built around the city of Washington really only saw one battle. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but that was the biggest threat to Washington at that point in the war. 1863 was a fairly quiet year in this area, still more training, more building up of forces. In 1864, Ulysses S. Grant became commander of the Army of the Potomac and the armies of the Union. And his overland campaign to attack down towards Richmond used up many men. And he realized that he had a big supply of trained Union soldiers right up here around Washington. So these heavy artillery regiments that were stationed around Washington were transferred down to Grant's army, and the defenses of Washington became greatly weakened at that point. Now these men, heavy artillery men who had those 2 years, 1862, 1863, early 1864, living fairly luxurious lives as far as soldiers go, were then thrown into some of the thickest combat and had extremely high casualties at places like Cold Harbor and Petersburg. These guys had no idea of how to fight the Civil War at that point, so they would go into combat standing up, running at the enemy, and were torn to pieces frequently. The one thing that Lee did in 1864 to try to relieve the pressure on the campaign down there was to send Jubal Early's corps of the Confederate Army up to attack Washington. They did this by marching up the Shenandoah Valley, up towards Hagerstown, to Frederick, had the small Battle of Monocacy in which they were able to push aside General Lew Wallace's Union forces, and then continued on down to Washington. Unfortunately for Jubal Early, fortunately for the Union, Union troops were able to get into Washington and get to the fortifications in time, basically with a day, the last day basically they had to spare, get into the fortifications at Fort Stevens and the adjacent forts in order to prevent Jubal Early from being able to push through the Union forts and on into D.C. At the end of the war, most of these fortifications were immediately no longer used. It was recommended that 10 of the forts on each side of the Potomac River stay in existence as defensive positions for the capital, since the capital had no real defensive positions before that. But by July 1866, really all the fortifications were no longer in existence. So, Karl?
I wanted to say a few words about some things that occurred or were created during the time of the war that are still around, and take a little bit of exception to what Dave just said. Fort Whipple was built on the grounds of the Arlington Plantation, and unlike most of the other forts, it was built on government land. The government had seized the title to Arlington Plantation. So Fort Whipple got to stay in existence, and a bit later name was changed to Fort Myer, and as we all know, it's still there. So, you know, the damn Yankees who came in have been here ever since 1861, or I think the fort was actually built in 63? 63. So we have been continuously occupied right here since 1863. We all are aware of Arlington Cemetery, which started during the war. In May of 1864, Major General Meigs, who was the Quartermaster General of the Army, selected 200 acres of the Arlington Plantation to be a cemetery. Soldiers and others had been dying at great enough rates that they were filling up the existing cemeteries in Washington and elsewhere at a rapid rate. And so additional cemetery space was needed. The first burials that happened in the cemetery were not battle casualties, but were victims of disease. But battle casualties later were interred there. And when I say casualties, they were men who were wounded in battle, brought back to hospitals here in the Washington area, and then died in the hospital. Also, there were numbers of civilians. There were large numbers of freed people, former slaves, who had flocked into the Washington, D.C. area, some of them coming from Maryland, which was a slave state, some of them coming from Washington, which had been a slave territory before the war, but the slaves in Washington were emancipated by congressional action in 1862. Some of them coming from areas further south who had self-liberated and made their way north to the Washington area, and of course the rate that this happened increased as the armies moved further south. There were large camps of these people. The camps were not particularly healthy. They were crowded, they were disease-ridden, and many of them died. I've seen estimates of 1 in 7 died of the inhabitants of Camp Barker, which was in the District of Columbia, died in a period of about 2 years. So that's a pretty high death rate. Space was needed to inter all these people, and a portion of the Arlington estate was selected for that purpose. The initial burials were in what's now called Section 27. It's in the far northeast part of the cemetery. But when General Meigs found out that the initial burials were being held way out over on the far corner of the estate, he didn't like the idea of Robert E. Lee's house being left sort of unmolested, and he directed that future burials be made much closer to the house so that it could never be used again as a residence. And so within about a week of the initial burials, they started burying people right in Mrs. Lee's rose garden, right there at the house. I mentioned all of those freed people who were located in camps in Washington and how terrible the conditions were. And as a result of that, there was a special camp called Freedmen's Village that was set up also on the grounds of the Arlington plantation to serve as a place where these people could live. It started in May of 1863 with temporary quarters in tents. By December of 1863, there was a formal opening, and at that time there were a number of buildings that were built. But this was supposed to be a place of temporary refuge for these former slaves, and also to give them an opportunity for education and training. There were schools that were set up to teach literacy and also various trades like dressmaking, carpentry, and things like that. After the war was over, the custody of that was transferred from the War Department to a new agency of the federal government called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau. By 1867, the character of the place had changed somewhat. It was no longer really a temporary place. There, people would come in, stay for a few months, learn something, and then move out, but it had become an established community. It remained in existence until approximately 1890 as an established community of African Americans here in Alexandria County. And in a sense, it still exists, because about 1890, when the federal government decided they really wanted to take it back over again and obtain the land, the residents moved out, and many of them moved into sort of close-in areas and established neighborhoods which still exist today. The Knock neighborhood, the Queen City neighborhood, the Arlington View neighborhood. There was a neighborhood that was established right at the foot of the 14th Street, the Long Bridge, called South Washington. All of those became established neighborhoods and continued well into the 20th century. South Washington disappeared when the Pentagon was built, but the residents again moved into established neighborhoods. There were 3 churches that were established in Freedmen's Village, that when the village was disestablished, they moved into the county, and they still exist today. That's Mount Zion and Lomax and Mount Olive. And those are still thriving congregations today. So out of those things which I mentioned, the cemetery, Fort Myer, and the Freedmen's Village, in a manner of speaking, they are still with us today. And this concludes the prepared remarks. Dave, why don't you come on up?
I think it's time to thank Ken and Dave. And I think it's been a pretty good lecture. As I say, it's being televised. I said it was the school system. I was wrong. It is the county television system. You can hear the county system on Comcast 25, Verizon 40. There is a program this week at 6 o'clock on this Friday dealing with Vietnam and the lessons we should have learned from that. I gather it's a good one. The county's program is good, but our program here today has been very good, and I want to thank these gentlemen for a fine job.
I'm willing to hang around for a little bit longer if anybody wants to talk.